The hot summer sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Carlin, Nevada. As Hayley Nelson stumbled toward the Lucky Strike Saloon, one hand pressed against her swollen belly, the other reaching desperately for support that wasn't there. Her vision blurred, dark spots dancing before her eyes as the ground beneath her feet seemed to tilt and sway. The journey from the stagecoach had taken everything she had left, and now, as the wooden porch of the saloon came into view, her strength finally gave out. It was 1873, and the mining town of Carlin was still finding its footing after the Central Pacific Railroad had established it as a division point just 5 years prior. The street was busy with miners, railroad workers, and travelers passing through. But as Hayley collapsed into the dirt, it seemed no one noticed no one except for Matthew Morgan, who had just stepped out of the general store across the way. Matthew had seen the woman the moment she disembarked from the stagecoach. Something about her solitary figure and careful movements had caught his attention. When she suddenly crumpled to the ground outside the saloon, he didn't hesitate. Dropping the sack of feed he'd just purchased, he sprinted across the rutted street, dodging a wagon loaded with lumber. Miss, can you hear me?" Matthew knelt beside her in the dust, gently turning her onto her back. Her face was pale beneath the dirt and travel grime, but even so, he could see she was beautiful and very pregnant. Her eyelids fluttered as he carefully brushed back a strand of auburn hair that had escaped from beneath her bonnet. "Water," she whispered, her cracked lips barely moving. Matthew looked up at the gathering crowd. "Someone fetch a doctor," he called out, then turned to the saloon keeper who had stepped onto the porch. "Sam, bring water quick." As Sam hurried inside, Matthew carefully assessed the woman. Her dress, though dusty and travel-worn, was well made, suggesting she wasn't destitute. But she wore no wedding ring, and she had arrived alone on the stagecoach. In a town like Carlin, that would be enough to set tongues wagging. "Here you are, Morgan," Sam said, returning with a tin cup of water. Matthew held the cup to the woman's lips, supporting her head with his other hand. "Small sips," he instructed gently as she tried to gulp the water. "That's it. Easy now. Is the doctor coming?" Matthew asked, not taking his eyes off the woman. "Doc Wilson's out at the Morrison place," someone in the crowd replied. "Their boy broke his leg. Won't be back till evening." Matthew made a quick decision. He couldn't leave her lying in the street, and the local boarding house was no place for a woman in her condition, especially one who appeared to be traveling alone. "I'm going to take you to my place," he told her softly. "It's not far and you need to rest. Is that all right?" The woman's eyes, a striking hazel color, focused on his face for a moment. She gave a faint nod before they closed again. With careful movements, Matthew slipped one arm under her knees and the other around her shoulders, lifting her as gently as possible. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, despite her pregnancy. "Morgan taking in strays again," someone muttered from the crowd, but Matthew ignored them, concentrating on carrying his fragile burden through the town toward his modest homestead on the outskirts. His small ranch was nothing grand, just 20 acres with a sturdy cabin, a barn, and a corral for the horses he bred and trained. It was enough for him, though sometimes the silence of the place weighed on him in a way the open range never had during his years as a cowhand. By the time he reached his cabin, the woman had regained consciousness, though she remained weak and disoriented. "Where am I?" she asked as he carefully laid her on his bed. "My home," Matthew replied, pulling a chair up beside the bed. "I'm Matthew Morgan." "You collapsed outside the saloon in Carlin." "Carlin," she repeated, as if testing the word. "I made it then." "You came here on purpose?" Matthew asked, surprised. Carlin wasn't exactly a destination for most folks, especially not unaccompanied women in her condition. She nodded weakly. I'm Hayley Nelson. Her hand went protectively to her belly. Thank you for helping me, Mr. Morgan. Matthew, he corrected gently. And you're welcome, Miss Nelson. Though I have to ask what brings you to Carlin in your condition and all alone. A shadow crossed her face. I'm looking for someone. My child's father. Matthew nodded, keeping his expression neutral despite the conclusions already forming in his mind. Well, you need to rest now. The doctor will be by later to check on you. I can't impose, she began, trying to sit up. You're not imposing, Matthew said firmly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. You're in no condition to go anywhere right now. When was the last time you ate? Hayley hesitated, and that was answer enough for Matthew. He stood up. I'll fix something, you rest. As he moved around his small kitchen, heating up leftover stew and cutting bread, Matthew pondered the strange turn his day had taken. He'd gone into town for supplies, not expecting to return with a pregnant woman who was clearly running from something, or toward something with a determination strong enough to risk her health and her unborn child's. Matthew was 32 and had spent most of his life on the move, working cattle drives across the territories, before finally settling in Carlin 3 years ago. He'd seen enough of life to know that people, especially women traveling alone, usually had good reasons for their actions, even if those reasons weren't immediately apparent to others. He returned to find Hayley had fallen asleep, her breathing deep and even. Setting the tray on the side table, he took a moment to really look at her. She was young, mid-20s, he guessed, with delicate features and that striking auburn hair. Even exhausted and dusty from travel, there was a quiet dignity about her that stirred something protective in him. Matthew quietly left the room, closing the door behind him. He would let her sleep while he tended to his chores. Whatever her story was, it could wait until she'd recovered her strength. When Hayley woke, the light streaming through the window had shifted, taking on the golden hue of late afternoon. For a moment, she felt disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings causing a flicker of panic until the events of the day came rushing back. She was in Carlin, in the home of a man named Matthew Morgan who had helped her when she'd collapsed. As if summoned by her thoughts, there was a gentle knock at the door before it opened, revealing Matthew with a tray. "You're awake," he said, his voice deep but gentle. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Hayley replied, pushing herself into a sitting position. She was surprised to find it was true. The dizziness had receded, and though she was still tired, she no longer felt as though she might shatter into pieces. "I brought food," Matthew said, setting the tray on her lap once she was settled. "It's nothing fancy, just stew and bread, but it's filling." "Thank you," Hayley said, suddenly realizing how hungry she was. The stew smelled wonderful, rich with meat and vegetables. "You're very kind to a stranger." Matthew shrugged, looking slightly uncomfortable with the praise. "It's what anyone would do." "No," Hayley said quietly, thinking of the many doors that had been closed to her over the past months. "It's not." She ate in silence for a few minutes while Matthew sat in the chair beside the bed, his presence somehow both reassuring and slightly unnerving. He was a handsome man, she couldn't help but notice, with sun-browned skin and eyes the color of a stormy sky. His hands, resting on his knees, were large and calloused working hands, but they had been gentle when he'd carried her. "The doctor should be here soon," Matthew said, breaking the silence. "He was out at a farm when you collapsed, but I sent word for him to come here when he returned to town." Hayley nodded, setting aside her spoon. "I appreciate that, but I don't think I need a doctor. I just hadn't eaten or drunk enough during the journey. I'm feeling much better now." Matthew's expression turned stern. "With all due respect, Miss Nelson, you're carrying a child and you fainted dead away in the street. You'll see the doctor." His tone left no room for argument, and Hayley found herself both irritated and oddly comforted by his concern. It had been a long time since anyone had worried about her welfare. "All right," she conceded. "But afterward, I'll need to find lodgings in town. I can't impose on you any longer." "There's only one boarding house in Carlin," Matthew said, "and it's not suitable for a woman in your condition. It mainly caters to railroad workers and miners passing through." "I don't have much choice," Hayley replied. "I need to stay in town to find the person I'm looking for." Matthew studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You can stay here," he finally said. "I have a second room I use for storage. I can clear it out, put a bed in there." Hayley stared at him in surprise. "That's very generous, but I couldn't possibly—" "It's not charity," Matthew interrupted, his tone matter of fact. "You can help around the place when you're feeling stronger. I could use a hand with the cooking and such, and it would only be until you find who you're looking for, or—" He glanced at her swollen belly. "Or until the baby comes," Hayley finished for him. Matthew nodded. "Unless you'd prefer the boarding house, I won't force you to stay here." Hayley considered her options. She had limited funds, barely enough to last a month if she was careful. Staying with Matthew would allow her to conserve her resources while she searched for Joseph Carter, the man who had promised her the world and then disappeared when she told him she was expecting his child. "If you're certain it wouldn't be an imposition," she said slowly, "I would be grateful for the arrangement, just until I find who I'm looking for." Matthew nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Then it's settled." He stood up, taking the tray from her lap. "Rest now. I'll be outside if you need anything. The doctor should arrive soon." After he left, Hayley sank back against the pillows, one hand resting on her belly where the baby kicked steadily. She had come to Carlin because Joseph's last letter had mentioned taking work with the railroad here. She had to find him, had to make him understand his responsibilities to her and their child. She had nowhere else to go, no family to return to after her father had disowned her. For now, though, Matthew Morgan's unexpected kindness had given her a reprieve, a safe place to gather her strength. She would not abuse that kindness, she resolved. She would find Joseph quickly and sort out her future, one way or another. Dr. Wilson arrived as the sun was setting, a gray-haired man with kind eyes and an efficient manner. He examined Hayley thoroughly while Matthew waited outside. "Dehydration and exhaustion," the doctor pronounced when he emerged from the bedroom. "Nothing more serious, thankfully. The baby seems healthy, active, and in the right position. She's about 7 months along by my estimation." Matthew felt a knot of tension he hadn't realized he was carrying loosen at the doctor's words. "What should I do for her?" "Make sure she eats regularly and drinks plenty of water. No strenuous activity for a few days. She needs rest more than anything, doctor." Wilson packed his instruments back into his bag. "She's young and otherwise healthy. She should recover quickly." After the doctor left, Matthew returned to check on Hayley. She was sitting up in bed, looking more alert than before. "The doctor says you're going to be fine," Matthew told her. "Both of you?" "Yes," Hayley agreed. He was very kind. An awkward silence fell between them, and Matthew realized that they were essentially strangers who had suddenly found themselves living under the same roof due to extraordinary circumstances. "I should let you rest," he said finally. "Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, I can take you into town. If you tell me who you're looking for, I might be able to help. Carlin's not a large place." Hayley hesitated, and Matthew could see her weighing her words carefully. "His name is Joseph Carter. He was working for the railroad, at least that's what he wrote in his last letter." Matthew nodded, though the name didn't immediately ring a bell. "I'll ask around. The railroad employs a lot of men, but someone will know him if he's here." "Thank you," Hayley said softly. She looked vulnerable sitting there in his bed, her hands protectively cradling her unborn child. "For everything. Get some rest, Miss Nelson. I'll be sleeping in the front room if you need anything during the night." As Matthew made up a pallet on the floor by the fireplace, he found himself wondering about Joseph Carter and what kind of man would leave a woman like Hayley to face pregnancy alone. There was a story there, and he suspected it wasn't a happy one. The next few days fell into an unexpected pattern. Hayley regained her strength quickly, proving herself to be far more resilient than her initial collapse had suggested. True to her word, she insisted on helping around the cabin, preparing meals and tidying up despite Matthew's protests that she should rest. "I've never been one for idleness," she told him on the third morning when he found her making biscuits in the kitchen. "And I'm not an invalid. The baby and I are fine." Matthew had to admit that having her there transformed his simple cabin. The place had always been functional but Spartan. Now there were wild flowers in a jar on the table, the floors were swept clean, and meals had become something to look forward to rather than just a necessity. He had cleared out the small second room as promised, moving his spare gear to the barn and setting up a narrow bed. Hayley had moved in there, insisting that Matthew take back his own bed despite his protests. "You work hard all day with the horses," she'd said firmly. "You need proper rest. I'm quite comfortable in the small room." While Hayley settled into life at the ranch, Matthew made inquiries in town about Joseph Carter. What he learned didn't improve his opinion of the man. "Carter," Sam at the saloon had said. "Yeah, he was here all right. Worked for the railroad for about 3 months last winter. Smooth talker, that one, left owing money to half the businesses in town." "Any idea where he went?" Matthew had asked. Sam shook his head. "Said something about heading to Virginia City. There was talk of silver strikes there, but who knows? He wasn't the type to leave a forwarding address, if you take my meaning." Other accounts painted a similar picture. Joseph Carter had charmed his way through Carlin, leaving a trail of debts and broken promises. Matthew dreaded telling Hayley what he'd learned, knowing it would devastate her. When he returned to the ranch that evening, he found Hayley sitting on the porch, shelling peas. The sight of her there, looking so at home, caused an odd tightening in his chest. "You found out something," she said immediately, reading his expression as he dismounted. "About Joseph." Matthew tied his horse to the hitching post and climbed the steps to join her. "Yes," he admitted, sitting beside her on the bench. "He was here, but he left about 4 months ago. Most folks think he headed to Virginia City." Hayley's hand stilled, the half-shelled pea pod forgotten in her fingers. 4 months, she repeated softly. "Then I've missed him." Matthew hesitated, then added gently, "The people I spoke to, they didn't paint a favorable picture of him, Hayley. He left owing money all over town." She nodded, not looking surprised. "That sounds like Joseph. He always had grand plans but never quite enough money to see them through." She resumed shelling peas, her movements mechanical. "I suppose I knew deep down that I wouldn't find him here. It was foolish to hope." "It wasn't foolish," Matthew said. "Hope is never foolish." Hayley looked up at him then, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "What am I going to do now, Matthew? I have nowhere to go, very little money, and a baby coming in less than 2 months." Without thinking, Matthew reached out and covered her hand with his. "You'll stay here," he said firmly, "for as long as you need to." "I can't impose on you indefinitely. It's not an imposition," Matthew interrupted. "You've made this place more of a home in 3 days than I managed in 3 years. He squeezed her hand gently. "Stay, Hayley, at least until after the baby comes. Then you can decide what you want to do." Hayley looked at their joined hands, then back at his face. "Why are you so kind to me?" Matthew couldn't fully explain it himself. There was something about Hayley that had called to him from the moment he'd seen her. It wasn't just her beauty or her vulnerability. It was her quiet strength, her dignity in the face of circumstances that would have broken many others. "I reckon everyone deserves kindness," he said simply, "especially when they're carrying a little one." A small smile touched Hayley's lips. "Well, this little one and I are very grateful," she said softly. "And I promise I won't be a burden. I'll earn my keep." "You already have," Matthew assured her. He reluctantly released her hand and stood up. "I'd better see to the horses. Dinner smells wonderful, by the way." As he walked toward the barn, Matthew acknowledged to himself that Hayley Nelson was becoming important to him in a way that went beyond simple charity or neighborly assistance. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. She was carrying another man's child, still seeking that man despite his apparent unworthiness, and Matthew had no right to feel anything beyond friendly concern for her. Yet each day, as he watched her move about his home, as they shared meals and conversation, as he learned more about her life before Carlin, he found himself falling deeper under her spell. Hayley, for her part, found herself settling into life at Matthew's ranch with surprising ease. The disappointment of missing Joseph in Carlin had been tempered by the realization that she wasn't entirely surprised by his disappearance. In the months since she had last seen him, memories had surfaced of broken promises, of convenient excuses, of charm deployed precisely when questions became too probing. She had loved him once, or thought she had, but now, with distance and time, she wondered if she had merely been seduced by his easy manner and grand promises. Joseph had swept into her life in Sacramento, where she had been working as a schoolteacher after her mother's death. He had painted pictures of a future filled with adventure and prosperity, and she, grieving and lonely, had been all too willing to believe him. When she discovered she was expecting, Joseph had sworn he would send for her once he was established in his new job. Weeks had turned to months with only occasional letters, each one promising that soon, very soon, he would have enough saved to bring her to him. Meanwhile, her condition had become impossible to hide. The school board had dismissed her, her landlady had evicted her, and her father, already disapproving of Joseph, had refused to take her in. With nowhere else to turn, she had spent nearly all her savings on the stagecoach fare to Carlin. Now, as she prepared for bed in the small room Matthew had given her, Hayley faced the reality that Joseph was gone, possibly for good. She had no way of knowing if he was truly in Virginia City, and even if he was, she had no means to get there in her condition. Carlin, which had been meant to be just a stop on her journey, now seemed to be where her journey ended, or perhaps, she thought with a glance toward the main room where Matthew was reading by lamplight, where a new journey began. The following weeks settled into a comfortable routine. Matthew tended to his horses during the day, breaking and training them for sale to ranchers and stagecoach companies throughout the territory. Hayley kept the house, cooked meals, and on pleasant days, sat on the porch sewing baby clothes from fabric Matthew had purchased in town. They talked easily, discovering shared interests in books and music. Matthew proved to be surprisingly well-read for a cowboy, explaining that long nights on cattle drives had given him a taste for literature. "My mother was a schoolteacher back in Ohio," he told Hayley one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "She made sure I had books even when we had little else." "My mother taught me to play the piano," Hayley shared in return. "She dreamed I would become an accomplished musician, but I was always more interested in books and teaching." "You were a teacher?" Matthew asked, looking impressed. Hayley nodded, a pang of loss hitting her as she thought of her classroom in Sacramento. "For 3 years. I loved it," she sighed. "I suppose that career is behind me now." "Why?" Matthew asked, Plenty of teachers have families. Not unwed mothers, Hayley pointed out gently. No school board would hire me now. Matthew frowned but didn't argue the point. They both knew she was right. Society's judgment of women was harsh and unyielding. What about you? Hayley asked, changing the subject. Have you always trained horses? Matthew shook his head. I was a cowhand for most of my life, moving from ranch to ranch following the herds. Did a stint as a cavalry scout during the war, which is where I learned about horses. After that, I couldn't go back to punching cows. Wanted something that was mine. And now you have this place, Hayley said, looking out at the small but well-kept ranch. Now I have this place, Matthew agreed, his gaze following hers. It's not much, but it's home. Hayley thought about how empty her life had felt after her mother died, how she had thrown herself into teaching by day but returned each night to a silent, lonely room. She thought about how Joseph's appearance had seemed like salvation, filling that emptiness with his laughter and stories and promises. Looking at Matthew's profile in the fading light, she wondered if he too had been seeking to fill an emptiness when he settled in Carlin. It's a good home, she said softly, and was rewarded with a smile that made her heart flutter in a way it hadn't in a very long time. As her 8th month of pregnancy progressed, Hayley found herself increasingly grateful for Matthew's steady presence. The baby was active, especially at night, and her back ached constantly. Matthew noticed her discomfort without her having to mention it, fashioning a cushion for the rocking chair and insisting she rest frequently. I'm not made of glass, she protested one afternoon when he took the laundry basket from her hands. No, but there's no need for you to strain yourself when I'm perfectly capable of hanging clothes, he replied, carrying the basket outside. Hayley followed him, watching as he awkwardly but determinedly pinned shirts and sheets to the clothesline. You're going to be a wonderful father someday, she said without thinking, then blushed when Matthew turned to look at her with an unreadable expression. You think so? He asked quietly. Yes, Hayley said, her voice firm despite her embarrassment. You're kind and patient and gentle. Matthew's hand stilled on the clothespin. I've never really thought about having children, he admitted. My life wasn't settled enough before. And now? Hayley asked, her heart suddenly pounding for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. Matthew looked at her for a long moment, his eyes serious. Now I'm beginning to see the appeal. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Hayley was acutely aware of the swell of her belly, of the child she carried, Joseph's child, and of the impropriety of the feeling stirring within her for Matthew. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching horses. Matthew turned, shading his eyes against the sun to see who was coming. It's Sam from the saloon, he said, his voice returning to its normal tone. Wonder what brings him out here. Sam pulled his wagon to a stop in front of the cabin. Morgan, he called out in greeting, then tipped his hat to Hayley. Madam, what brings you out this way, Sam? Matthew asked, approaching the wagon. Got a letter for the lady, Sam replied, pulling an envelope from his pocket. Came in with the mail yesterday. Addressed to Hayley Nelson, care of the Lucky Strike Saloon, Carlin. Since everyone knows she's staying out here with you, I figured I'd deliver it myself. Hayley stepped forward, her heart racing. Thank you, she said, taking the letter. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Joseph. No trouble, Sam said, gathering up his reins. Needed to check on my brother's place down the road anyway. He tipped his hat again. Good day to you both. As Sam drove away, Hayley stared at the letter in her hands, a tumult of emotions coursing through her. After all this time, Joseph had written to her. How had he known she was in Carlin? It's from him, isn't it? Matthew asked quietly. From Joseph Carter. Hayley nodded, unable to speak. You want to read it alone? Matthew asked, his voice carefully neutral. Yes, Hayley said, looking up at him with an apology in her eyes. If you don't mind. Of course not. I have work to do in the barn anyway. Matthew turned and walked away, his shoulders straight but tension visible in every line of his body. Hayley went inside and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope for several minutes before finding the courage to open it. Finally, she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letter was brief, written in Joseph's distinctive flowing hand. Hayley, I heard from a friend passing through Virginia City that you were looking for me in Carlin. I'm sorry I wasn't there to meet you. Business opportunities have taken me to San Francisco, where I expect to remain for some time. I understand your situation is difficult, but I must be honest with you. I am not prepared for the responsibilities of fatherhood, nor am I in a position to offer you marriage. I suggest you return to your father's home, or seek assistance from one of the charitable organizations that help women in your circumstances. I have enclosed $20 to aid you in whatever course you choose. With regrets, Joseph Carter. Hayley stared at the letter, reading it twice more as if the words might somehow rearrange themselves into something less cruel, less dismissive. No, my dear Hayley. No questions about her well-being or the baby's, not even an acknowledgement that the child was his. Just cold advice to go home to a father who had disowned her, or seek charity, along with a paltry sum that wouldn't even cover a stagecoach ticket to Sacramento. The tears, when they came, were not for the loss of Joseph. She realized she had already mourned that loss, but for the final death of her hopes for a normal family life for her child. She had clung to the belief that Joseph would do the right thing when faced with her condition in person, that he would honor his earlier promises of marriage and a home. She was still sitting at the table, tears silently streaming down her face, when Matthew came in an hour later. He took one look at her and was immediately at her side, kneeling beside her chair. Hayley, what is it? What's happened? Wordlessly, she handed him the letter. He read it quickly, his expression darkening with each line. When he finished, he looked up at her, anger and compassion warring in his eyes. I'm sorry, he said simply. You deserved better than this. Did I? Hayley asked, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. I was foolish enough to believe his promises too. She gestured to her swollen belly, unable to finish the sentence. Trusting someone you love isn't foolish, Matthew said firmly. He's the one who should be ashamed, not you. It doesn't matter now, Hayley said, taking the letter back and folding it carefully. At least now I know for certain. There will be no miraculous reunion, no wedding, no father for my child. I need to plan accordingly. What will you do? Matthew asked, his voice carefully neutral. Hayley shook her head. I don't know yet. I have a little money and now this. She held up the envelope containing Joseph's $20. Perhaps enough to get to a larger city where I might find work after the baby comes. You don't have to leave, Matthew said quickly. Carlin is growing. There might be opportunities here. As what? An unwed mother with no family, no connections. Hayley shook her head. You know how such women are viewed, Matthew, and in a small town like this, the gossip would follow my child forever. Matthew took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. Stay, he said simply. Stay here with me. Hayley stared at him, not sure she understood his meaning. I can't continue to impose on your hospitality indefinitely, Matthew. It's not an imposition, he insisted, and I'm not suggesting. I'm not asking for anything in return. He took a deep breath as if gathering his courage. I'm asking you to marry me, Hayley. The world seemed to stop for a moment as Hayley tried to process his words. Marry you, she echoed, certain she had misheard. But why would you? Because I care for you, Matthew said simply. Because in these past weeks, you've made this place a home in ways I never could. Because your child deserves a father, and I would be honored to fill that role." "Matthew," Hayley said softly, her heart conflicted, "you don't have to sacrifice your freedom for my sake. You barely know me." "I know enough," he insisted. "I know you're kind and brave and strong. I know you make the best biscuits I've ever tasted." That drew a small smile from her. "I know that when you talk about teaching, your whole face lights up. I know that you hum to yourself when you think no one's listening." Hayley was touched by his observations, by the clear evidence that he had been paying attention to her in ways Joseph never had. "But what about love?" she asked quietly. "Don't you want to marry for love?" Matthew's eyes held her steadily. "Who says I'm not?" The simple declaration stole Hayley's breath. "Matthew, I'm not asking for promises," he continued quickly. "I know your heart has been hurt. I know this isn't what you planned. But I'm offering you a home, protection for you and your child, and my heart if you want it." Hayley looked at this man who had rescued her from the street, who had opened his home to her, who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. Could she marry him? Could she build a life with him? He wasn't Joseph, with his smooth words and grand promises, but perhaps that was for the best. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "It's so sudden." "You don't have to answer now," Matthew said, standing up. "Think about it. Talk to the doctor or the preacher's wife if you want an outside opinion." He smiled slightly. "I'm not going anywhere." That night, Hayley lay awake for hours, her mind racing through possibilities. Marriage to Matthew would solve so many problems. Her child would have a name, a home, a father. She would have security and respectability. But was it fair to Matthew? Was it fair to bind him to another man's child, to a woman whose heart was still healing? Yet when she thought of leaving Carlin, of never seeing Matthew again, a hollow ache formed in her chest. In the short time she'd known him, he had become important to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. His steady presence, his quiet strength, his unexpected moments of tenderness, all of these had worked their way into her heart. By morning, she had made her decision. She found Matthew at the corral, watching as a young colt pranced around the enclosure. "He's got spirit," Hayley commented, coming to stand beside him at the fence. Matthew nodded. "He'll make a fine saddle horse once he learns to channel that energy." They watched the colt in silence for a moment, then Hayley said quietly, "I've been thinking about your proposal." Matthew turned to face her, his expression guarded. "And I would be honored to be your wife," Hayley said, meeting his gaze steadily. "If you're certain it's what you want." The smile that broke across Matthew's face was like sunrise after a long night. "It is," he said firmly. "It absolutely is. But I want you to understand something," Hayley continued, needing to be completely honest. "I care for you deeply, Matthew. These past weeks have shown me what a good, honorable man you are, but I'm still healing from everything that's happened. I may not be able to offer you the kind of love a husband deserves, at least not right away." Matthew took her hands in his. "Hayley, I'm not asking for more than you can give. We can build this marriage day by day, just as we've been building our friendship. The rest will come in its own time." His understanding brought tears to her eyes. "I don't deserve you," she whispered. "You deserve far better," Matthew replied seriously. "But I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of you and your child." The wedding took place a week later in Carlin's small church. It was a simple ceremony, attended by a few of Matthew's friends and acquaintances from town. Hayley wore a dress Matthew had insisted on buying from the general store, a soft blue that brought out the color of her eyes with wildflowers in her hair. The preacher, a kindly older man named Reverend Harris, kept the service brief. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Matthew's kiss was gentle and reverent, a promise rather than a demand. That night, Hayley moved her few belongings into Matthew's room. They had discussed sleeping arrangements frankly, and Matthew had insisted he would sleep on a pallet on the floor until Hayley felt comfortable sharing the bed. "You're carrying a child," he'd said. "You need proper rest. And besides, I want our marriage to be built on trust, not obligation." As she prepared for bed, Hayley was struck by the contrast between Matthew's consideration and Joseph's selfishness. Joseph had taken what he wanted with pretty words and promises, then vanished when faced with consequences. Matthew asked for nothing, yet gave everything: his name, his home, his protection. Lying in Matthew's bed, listening to his steady breathing from his pallet on the floor, Hayley placed a hand on her belly where the baby kicked rhythmically. "We're going to be all right," she whispered to her unborn child. "Matthew will take care of us, and I'm going to take care of him too." The following weeks were a time of adjustment for both of them. They were learning to navigate life as husband and wife while still getting to know each other. Matthew was unfailingly respectful of Hayley's boundaries, never pushing for more intimacy than she was ready to give, content with the small gestures of affection she felt comfortable offering: a touch on the arm, a hand on his shoulder, a kiss on the cheek. Hayley, for her part, found herself increasingly drawn to Matthew's quiet strength. He worked from dawn until dusk with the horses, yet always found time to ask about her day, to listen to her thoughts, to share stories of his own past. He built a cradle for the baby from pine boards, carefully sanding each piece until it was smooth as silk, and carried water for her bath without being asked. By the beginning of September, with her due date fast approaching, Hayley realized that the feelings growing inside her were more than gratitude or friendship. She found herself watching Matthew when he wasn't looking, appreciating the way sunlight caught in his dark hair, the strength in his hands as he worked with the horses, the kindness in his eyes when he looked at her. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the Nevada sky in shades of orange and gold, Hayley found the courage to express some of what she was feeling. "I want to thank you," she said softly, "for everything you've done for me, for us." She placed a hand on her belly. Matthew smiled. "You don't need to thank me, Hayley. You're my wife." "Yes, but we both know the circumstances were unusual. You took on a responsibility that wasn't yours." She took a deep breath. "What I'm trying to say is I'm grateful, but it's more than that. I'm coming to care for you, Matthew, very much." The look that came into his eyes made her heart race. "I care for you too, Hayley, more than I can say. I think." Hayley hesitated, then reached out to take his hand. "I think I might be falling in love with you." Matthew's fingers tightened around hers. "Hayley," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I fell in love with you the day you made biscuits in my kitchen and told me you weren't an invalid." Hayley laughed, even as tears sprang to her eyes. "That's a strange moment to fall in love." "No," Matthew said seriously. "It was the moment I saw your spirit, your determination. I knew then that you were someone special." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. But Hayley met him halfway, her lips finding his in a kiss that was both tender and filled with promise. That night, for the first time, Matthew didn't sleep on the floor. They lay together in the bed, Hayley's back pressed against his chest, his arm draped protectively over her and their unborn child. It wasn't passion that drove them to this new intimacy, but a deepening bond, a sense of belonging together that felt as natural as breathing. The baby came a week later, in the middle of the night during a rare September thunderstorm. Matthew rode through the downpour to fetch Dr. Wilson, then paced anxiously outside the bedroom door while Hayley labored inside with the doctor and Mrs. Harris, the preacher's wife who had experience as a midwife. The hours stretched endlessly, each cry from Hayley cutting through Matthew like a knife. He had never felt so helpless, so terrified. He had grown to love this woman with every fiber of his being, and now he could do nothing but wait and pray as she fought to bring her child into the world. Finally, as dawn was breaking, a different cry pierced the air, the indignant wail of a newborn. Matthew froze, his heart pounding as the door opened and Mrs. Harris emerged, beaming despite her exhaustion. "Congratulations, Mr. Morgan," she said. "You have a healthy son and your wife is doing well." Matthew's legs nearly gave way beneath him. "A son," he repeated, his voice cracking. "And Hayley, she's really all right. See for yourself," Mrs. Harris said, stepping aside to let him enter. Matthew approached the bed cautiously, almost afraid of what he would find. But the sight that greeted him stole his breath away. Hayley, pale but smiling, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked up as he entered, her eyes bright with tears and joy. "Matthew," she said softly, "come meet your son, your son." The words hit him like a physical blow. This child, born of Hayley's body but fathered by another man, was his son in every way that mattered. The realization filled him with a fierce, protective love that took him by surprise. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, gazing down at the small, wrinkled face peering out from the blanket. A shock of dark hair, still damp from birth, capped the baby's head. "He's beautiful," Matthew whispered, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's cheek. "Just like his mother." "I thought we might name him Samuel," Hayley said. "After your father, if that's all right with you." Matthew looked up in surprise. He had mentioned his father, Samuel Morgan, only once, telling Hayley how the man had taught him to ride and rope before dying of pneumonia when Matthew was 12. "You would do that?" he asked, deeply moved by the gesture. "Of course," Hayley said simply. "You're his father, Matthew, in every way that matters." "Samuel," Matthew repeated, looking back at the baby. "Samuel Morgan, it's a good name, a strong name." "Would you like to hold him?" Hayley asked. Matthew hesitated, suddenly afraid. His hands, used to breaking horses and mending fences, seemed too large and rough for something so small and fragile. But Hayley was already placing the bundle in his arms, showing him how to support the baby's head. The moment Samuel settled against his chest, Matthew felt something shift inside him, as if pieces of his heart that he hadn't even known were missing suddenly slid into place. This was his son. His family. Tears blurred his vision as he looked up at Hayley. "Thank you," he whispered. Hayley reached out to touch his face, brushing away a tear with her thumb. "No, Matthew, thank you for giving us a home, for giving Samuel your name, for—" Her voice broke. "For loving us." "I do love you," Matthew said fiercely, "both of you, more than I ever thought possible." As the doctor and Mrs. Harris quietly slipped out, giving the new family privacy, Matthew moved to sit beside Hayley on the bed, cradling Samuel between them. Outside, the storm had passed, and sunlight streamed through the window, bathing the room in golden light. "I never expected this," Hayley admitted softly, watching as Samuel's tiny fingers curled around Matthew's much larger one. "When I collapsed outside that saloon, I was at the end of my rope. I thought I had lost everything." "So did I before you came," Matthew replied. "I had a house, but not a home. I had work, but not purpose." He looked at her with all the love he felt shining in his eyes. "You and Samuel have given me both." As autumn gave way to winter, the Morgan family settled into a new rhythm. Samuel grew rapidly, a healthy, robust baby with his mother's hazel eyes and a temperament that matched his namesake's, according to Matthew. "My father was as stubborn as they come," Matthew told Hayley one evening as they watched Samuel, now 3 months old, struggling determinedly to roll over. "But he was also fair and kind. I see that in our boy. Our boy." The words still filled Hayley with warmth every time Matthew said them. He had never once, not even in their most private moments, referred to Samuel as anything but his son. He changed diapers, walked the floor with Samuel during colicky nights, and sang off key lullabies that nevertheless soothed the baby to sleep. Christmas came, the first for their little family. Matthew surprised Hayley with a small piano he had purchased from a family leaving Carlin. It wasn't new or particularly fine, but when Hayley sat down and played her first notes in over a year, her face glowed with such joy that Matthew knew it had been worth every penny and the considerable effort of getting it delivered secretly to the ranch. "How did you manage this?" Hayley asked in amazement, running her fingers lovingly over the keys. "I have my ways," Matthew replied with a wink, bouncing Samuel on his knee. "And I had help. Sam and a few of the boys from town brought it out yesterday while you were visiting Mrs. Harris." Hayley played Christmas carols while Matthew and Samuel listened, the baby's eyes wide with wonder at the sounds filling the cabin. Later, after Samuel was asleep in his cradle, Hayley and Matthew exchanged their personal gifts, a hand-tooled leather belt she had secretly worked on during Samuel's naps for him, and a delicate silver locket containing a tiny sketch of Samuel that Matthew had commissioned from a traveling artist passing through Carlin. "It's perfect," Hayley whispered as Matthew fastened the locket around her neck. "This has been the most wonderful Christmas of my life." "Mine too," Matthew agreed, drawing her into his arms. Their kiss was deep and tender, filled with the love that had grown between them over the months of their marriage. That night, for the first time since Samuel's birth, their embrace led to more. In the quiet darkness of their bedroom, with Samuel sleeping peacefully in his cradle nearby, Hayley and Matthew truly became husband and wife, their bodies expressing what their hearts already knew, that they belonged to each other completely. Afterward, lying in Matthew's arms, Hayley marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. The pain and fear of her abandonment by Joseph seemed like a distant memory, the collapse outside the Lucky Strike Saloon like something that had happened to someone else. "What are you thinking about?" Matthew asked, his fingers gently stroking her hair. "About how close I came to missing this," Hayley replied honestly. "If you hadn't been there that day, if you hadn't offered to help a stranger." "I was meant to find you," Matthew said simply. "Just as you were meant to find me." Hayley couldn't argue with that. Whatever forces had brought them together, chance, fate, divine providence, she was profoundly grateful for them. As winter turned to spring, Hayley found herself thinking more and more about teaching again. Samuel was thriving, the ranch was prospering thanks to Matthew's skill with horses, and Carlin was growing rapidly as more settlers arrived on the railroad. "You think the town might need a teacher soon?" she asked Matthew one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. Samuel, now 7 months old, was asleep on a blanket beside them. Matthew considered the question thoughtfully. "The town's growing fast enough that they've been talking about building a proper school. Right now, Reverend Harris teaches the few children in town in the church, but he's getting on in years." "I miss teaching," Hayley admitted. "Not that being Samuel's mother and your wife isn't fulfilling, but I was good at teaching. I loved it." "Then you should teach again," Matthew said simply. "Samuel's old enough that Mrs. Harris or one of the other women in town could watch him for a few hours a day. And I think Carlin would be lucky to have you educating its children." Hayley leaned over to kiss him, grateful once again for his unwavering support. "I'll speak to Reverend Harris next Sunday after service." The Reverend, it turned out, was delighted by the prospect of having a trained teacher take over the educational duties he had shouldered out of necessity rather than vocation. The town council quickly approved the arrangement, and by May, Hayley was teaching 15 children ranging in age from 6 to 14 in the church, while plans for a proper schoolhouse were drawn up. The work was challenging but deeply satisfying. Hayley found joy in introducing her pupils to literature, mathematics, and history, in watching their young minds expand with knowledge. Many of the children came from families that had never prioritized education, seeing it as a luxury rather than a necessity in the rugged West. Hayley was determined to change that perception. Matthew supported her ambition wholeheartedly, even building bookshelves for the church, and later helping to construct the new schoolhouse when the town finally raised enough money for the project. He took pride in his wife's accomplishments, bragging about "my Hayley" to anyone who would listen. As Samuel's first birthday approached, Hayley realized she was expecting again. The knowledge filled her with joy rather than the fear and uncertainty she had felt during her first pregnancy. This child would be born into a loving, stable home, with a father who had chosen to love them and a mother who had found her place in the world. When she told Matthew the news, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He lifted her off her feet in a jubilant embrace, then set her down gently as if suddenly afraid he might harm her or the baby. "Another child," he said in wonder, placing his hand reverently on her still flat stomach. "Our child." The emphasis on "our" wasn't lost on Hayley. Though Matthew had never once treated Samuel as anything less than his own flesh and blood, she knew this pregnancy was different. This child would be created from their love, a physical manifestation of the bond they shared. "Are you happy?" she asked, though his glowing face already gave her the answer. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Matthew replied, drawing her into his arms. "You, Samuel, this new little one, you've given me more than I ever dreamed of having." Samuel's birthday celebration was a community affair, with many of Hayley's pupils and their families joining the festivities at the Morgan Ranch. The little boy, now walking unsteadily and saying a few words, was the center of attention, charming everyone with his sunny smile and curious nature. As Hayley watched Matthew swinging Samuel high in the air, the little boy's laughter ringing out like bells, she felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. This was her family, her home, her life, not the one she had planned, but infinitely better than anything she could have imagined. That night, after the guests had gone and Samuel was sleeping soundly in the small room that was now his own, Hayley and Matthew sat on the porch swing Matthew had built the previous summer, her head resting on his shoulder as they gazed at the star-filled Nevada sky. "I've been thinking," Matthew said after a comfortable silence, "about expanding the house before the new baby comes. Samuel will need his room, and the new little one will need a nursery. And I thought maybe we could add a proper sitting room with space for your piano." Hayley smiled, picturing the expanded home filled with children's laughter and music. "That sounds wonderful, but it will be a lot of work." "I'll have help," Matthew assured her. "Sam and some of the other men from town owe me favors, and I want to give you a proper home, Hayley. You and our children deserve the best I can provide." "We already have the best," Hayley said softly, taking his hand and placing it over her heart. "We have you." Matthew's eyes, always so expressive, filled with emotion. "How did I get so lucky?" he wondered aloud. "I ask myself the same question every day," Hayley replied, leaning up to kiss him. "But I don't think it was luck, Matthew. I think it was fate. I was meant to collapse outside that saloon. You were meant to carry me home." "And never let you leave," Matthew added, completing the circle of their story. "Best decision I ever made." As they sat together under the vast Nevada sky, Hayley reflected on the strange, winding path that had led her to this moment. The pain and heartbreak of her past had been transformed into something beautiful, like the wildflowers that bloomed in the desert after rain. She had come to Carlin broken and afraid, seeking a man who had proven unworthy of her love. Instead, she had found Matthew steady, kind, loving Matthew who had picked up the pieces and helped her build something new and precious. "I love you," she whispered, the words simple but filled with the depth of her feeling. "And I love you," Matthew replied, drawing her closer. "Now and always." In the years that followed, the Morgan family continued to grow and thrive. Their second child, a daughter they named Grace, was born healthy and strong, with Matthew's stormy gray eyes and Hayley's auburn hair. 2 years later, they welcomed twins, a boy and a girl they named Michael and Helen, completing their family. The ranch expanded along with the house, as Matthew's reputation for training exceptional horses spread throughout Nevada and into California. Hayley continued teaching until the school board insisted she become the principal of Carlin's growing school, overseeing 3 additional teachers. Samuel grew into a thoughtful, intelligent young man who inherited his mother's love of learning and his father's way with horses. When he was 16, Matthew took him aside and told him the truth about his birth. Samuel listened quietly, then embraced the man who had raised him. "You're my father," he said simply, "the only one I've ever known or wanted." As for Joseph Carter, he appeared only once more in their lives. 15 years after Hayley had collapsed outside the Lucky Strike Saloon, a weathered, prematurely aged man arrived in Carlin asking after her. Joseph had fallen on hard times, his charm having failed to sustain him through years of gambling and failed schemes. He had come, he claimed, to make amends, perhaps hoping for financial assistance from the woman he had abandoned. Instead, he found Hayley Morgan, respected educator and wife of one of the area's most successful ranchers. When he approached her after church one Sunday, Matthew at her side and their 4 children surrounding them, Hayley barely recognized the broken man before her. After a brief, awkward conversation, during which Joseph's eyes repeatedly strayed to Samuel, now a tall, handsome young man of 15, Hayley felt nothing but pity for the man she had once loved. The bitterness and fear she had carried for so long had long since dissolved, replaced by gratitude for the life his abandonment had, ironically, made possible. "I wish you well, Joseph," she said sincerely as they parted. "I truly do." As Joseph walked away, Matthew squeezed her hand. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Hayley looked up at her husband, at the face that had become as familiar and beloved to her as her own reflection. "I'm perfect," she replied, and meant it. That evening, as they sat on the porch of their expanded home, watching their children play in the yard as the sun set behind the mountains, Hayley reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a desperate, pregnant woman collapsing outside a saloon to a fulfilled wife, mother, and educator. From a solitary cowboy to a devoted husband and father of 4. You ever think about how different our lives might have been if I hadn't been in town that day? Matthew asked, seeming to follow her thoughts. "Sometimes," Hayley admitted. "But then I remember what my mother used to say, that life has a way of leading us where we need to go, even when the path seems darkest." Matthew nodded, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Well, I'm grateful every day that my path led me to you." As the last rays of sunlight gilded the Nevada landscape in gold, and their children's laughter floated on the evening breeze, Hayley leaned against her husband's strong shoulder. "And I'm grateful," she whispered, "that you carried me home and never let me leave."